afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming to my session. This is already way more people than I was expecting, so I am so thankful that you all have chosen to be here. Just a couple of
Okay.
feel free to interrupt me at any time. This is meant to be a start of a discussion.
Your mic's not turned on.
Let's try that again. Everybody hear me now? All right, cool. So this is going to be the start of a discussion. This is not necessarily me lecturing to you. And we want to talk more about documentation. So I've got a slide deck here that we're going to make use of. And a remote that was working previously. Fantastic. You know, I'm going to have to start coming to rehearsal. Let's see if I do this and do that. All right, let's try that and try this. Okay, cool. All right, so the title of this presentation is We Should Write This Down Somewhere, Documentation for Beginners. And as I took a show of hands poll before we got started, very few of you are actual beginners to Mac administration, and we have a lot of people that are in the K-12 and the higher ed group as well. But don't worry, even if you're a seasoned administrator, this will still be useful for you. So my name is Dennis Wurster. I work in Rochester, New York at the Eastman School of Music, where I serve as the Associate Director of Computing Services. It's a role that I've been in for a couple of years now. And you can find me on Twitter at @WildDeep. Eastman School of Music is a world-class leader in music education, spanning 9 decades, producing award-winning graduates that boast Guggenheim Fellows, Grammy, and ASCAP award winners on its distinguished faculty. When I'm not doing MacAdmin things, I'm often out riding my bike. They made a wonderful Eastman bike jersey, so you can see me out there. I rode down to Geneseo, New York that day. So when I'm not doing that, you'll find me out riding. So, documentation. This is my blue sky, big idea to start with. Documentation sounds like a fantastic idea. The world is full of things that stress you out, that overwhelm you. And documentation can help you deal with that stress. It can help answer those questions. And to have that kind of resource is a wonderful thing to help ease your anxiety. But when it comes to having to produce it, then that's a whole different set of problems that you have to solve. And if you literally have nothing to start with, it sure can feel overwhelming to think about all the different factors involved before you even consider what tools to use or how often to keep it up to date or how to make sure your management knows to leave enough time to keep your documentation up to date. So if you've got absolutely nothing at all, it can all feel very overwhelming. So, quick poll. I love polls because it helps me know where the audience is. So how many of you have little to no documentation now? And you don't have to raise your hand. You could just give me one of these if you're a little embarrassed about it. Okay. I would say we're mostly focused on internal stuff today, but that's a good point. Documentation is not just about what your internal team uses. It's also about how do you communicate with the people that you support, whether you call those customers or clients or users or what have you. So of that, how many of you have been told that there's documentation somewhere, like you just got a new client, and they said, no, we've got that written down somewhere, I just know it. And you've gone and visited them 2 or 3 times, but they never can quite seem to put their finger on it? Okay. How many of you have some documentation, but it's kind of disorganized? You can't always find exactly what you need. You know it's in there somewhere. I'd say that's probably where I'm at. And how many of you have documentation that hasn't been updated or revised in a while? Or you just came into a new job and the last thing you saw was about macOS 10.7? Yeah, not so great, right? So that's a challenge. All right, now on the flip side, how many of you have documentation you're super proud of and just came in here to brag? No hands? No hands? Okay, almost. Good. We'll talk later. I want to learn from you. So here's what we're going to talk about. I've done a little bit of light research. When I'm out riding my bike, I often think about lots of things that I just can't quite put into words yet and try and figure out how to talk about it. I have an approach that I've sort of thought about and developed that sort of works for us, and I want to share that with you and get some ideas and some feedback about that. We'll talk a little bit about some factors that might influence what type of approach you might take in either starting documentation or improving what you already have. And then I'll finish up with some tips you can use. Again, I mentioned it before, but this session is a prompt for conversation. And you can feel free to share whatever you want with us. We'll either throw the catch box around. You'll see a URL at the top of the screen where you can ask a question. This is a feature of Google Slides. So when you ask that, you can submit it. And when you go to look to see what's here, you can also see what questions other people have submitted, and you can give them a thumbs up if you think that that's one that you want to get answered too. And we'll pause every once in a while to deal with that. So there's also a couple of things we're not going to cover. So we're not really going to cover the why of documentation. I'm going to assume that if you're here, you recognize that documentation is valuable, that it's a goal that you want to have, that you want it to be up to date, that you want it to be accessible, that you want it to be easy to understand, easy to read, and that you have enough support from your management to keep it rolling. And I'm also not going to talk about the specific tools to use. I kind of want this to be an evergreen style presentation so that even if you're watching this on YouTube, hey YouTube, that this still has some value for you. You'll find that if you look through my history, I'm the guy who always presents on things that are not technical at the technical conference, and that's one of the reasons why. So the goal for us is to figure out where to start and how do we do this without overwhelming ourselves with options. How do we just find a gentle place to get a handhold to get rolling on this? You know, life is complicated enough. We don't need to add anything to that. So one of the wonderful things about the MacAdmins community is we are all very interested in sharing with each other, and that's sort of why this conference even exists. And when I have a question or when I need to look something up, there's a few different people that I often go to. And for this particular question, I wanted to know, what do people think about this? So, like everybody else, I went to Twitter and decided to crowdsource at least some portion of this. So I said, hey, MacAdmin folk, tell me, if you had no documentation for your site, where would you even start? And it didn't take long. Results started trickling in right away. And I got some responses, and they tended to fall into a few different categories. And I bet these are not going to be that surprising to you. So the first category was represented by the opinion that you should work from the top down. So you should grab what's important to you, create a structure, and then fill that in as you go. Who can guess what the next one is? Bottom up, that's right. So other people said, you should start with whatever you're working on right now, whatever's in front of you, just write out what you're doing and how you do it. A third opinion has started to appear as well. It wasn't just top down or bottom up. The third opinion from some other very respected people said, you should concentrate on the stuff that keeps your paycheck coming in. The stuff that's most important to your business or your group, whatever it happens to be. Concentrate on what's vital. How do we keep the lights on? How do we make sure that we get to come back to MacAdmins? How do we make sure that other people can deal with the super important stuff while we're away? Not very surprising, right? These results. But one other one that came in that wasn't something I had thought about was to make sure that you recognize that you don't have to be the person who knows everything about your organization. It's okay to recognize that lots of other people in your department or in your organization are smart about what they do and how they do it. And they're more than happy to talk with you over coffee about what they do and how they do it, especially if they're not the people who have to write this stuff down. So feel free to make contact with other resources in your organization. So we've heard some opinions here. We've gotten some rough ideas about how to get started. And I used some of that and again went on a few more bike rides and kept thinking about this. And I developed my own opinion. My own opinion is let's start very simply. Let's figure out what's the smallest amount of work we can do that would still be valuable to figure out if we're wasting our time or not. And in the startup world, they call this the MVP, the minimum viable product. What is the smallest amount of effort we can put in to produce something that has value? So I tend to think that there are three fundamental components that go into any kind of documentation. And I want to share those with you today. These are kind of broad concepts, and I will also mention ways that you probably already have some documentation associated with this, and you may not even realize. So the first fundamental consideration is that you are dealing with people. And this is where we talk about our own role. This is where we talk about people on our team. This is where we talk about the people that we support. This is where we talk about the other departments that are in our organization, people that we interact with. And it might be HR, might be the finance department, it might be vendors from outside, if you've got a particular internet services vendor, or if you've got a vendor who handles all of your copiers or printers, then you have to be able to deal with those people as well. So you're probably already keeping track of those people in either some kind of directory or a roster of employees, for instance. And the bigger the organization you work for, the bigger that list is. So that's the first one, people. All right, so that leaves two left. So the second one, shocker, is stuff. Stuff, and that, again, that's a very general term. This is where we talk about the tools that people use, and those can be hardware tools. Those are probably the most obvious, hardware. Laptops, tablets, phones, desktops, monitors, networking equipment, printers. Stuff has certain attributes about it that make it kind of easy to document. Stuff has a location of where it exists. It has certain procedures that you use to access it. For instance, if there's a set of keys that go to the storage room, you can deal with those. It has procedures for how you procure it or how you replenish it if it's a consumable. So stuff wears out over time and it gets outdated. It needs to be replaced. And a list of the stuff that you have is probably the inventory that you have. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about this. Your list of stuff is different than mine. But we probably have a lot of things that are very similar. And finally, we have events. So the three big things, this is the third one. Events. Events is the part where we answer, what happens when? What happens when we need to have a new person start in our organization? What happens when somebody leaves our organization? We need to be able to handle these events and make sure that we can standardize whatever that work is with a process so we get consistent results and that people know what we're working on and what resources we'll need. So lists of events, unlike people or stuff, might be a schedule or a calendar. So that is my opinion. People, stuff, and events. And I'd like to thank you all for coming. I'll be outside if you need to find me. No? All right, no, I was just kidding. We're going to dive in just a little bit further. So we have to figure out how do these people, this stuff, the events, how do they all relate to each other? So we've got entities here, and now we have to figure out the relationship between them.
Can I ask, under events, would you also classify like configuration of stuff?
So we're going to talk about the question was that when it comes to events, would you also classify configuration as part of events? I personally think of configuration as more relating to the stuff itself. And I'll talk more about that soon, but thank you. So if you're looking for a place to start here and you don't want to overcomplicate things, let's just kind of figure out how those things relate to each other. So you've got people, you got your stuff, you got your events. And one of the ways that people and stuff are related is that people have stuff. So this would be, how are things deployed? Who do they belong to? Who owns them? And when it comes to stuff and events, when things happen, what's the procedure that has to be followed to do a particular action? Again, I know I'm speaking very broadly here with ridiculously non-specific terms, but I hope that you're all following along. And when it comes to events and people, when things happen, who needs to be notified about that? These are things to keep in mind when you're writing documentation. And it kind of goes the other direction with people and events too. Who's allowed to make requests? So when somebody says, hey, we're going to, where I work, we have a lot of presentations that are very similar to this. So so-and-so is coming to town and they need to have, we're doing a presentation that starts at Tuesday at 5 o'clock, and we think we need the following. Okay, they make requests. Are they allowed to make requests? Do you have a process for that? How do we inform those people? What are the rules to follow to be successful? So that's kind of one approach. This is sort of the mind map that I kind of worked out. And these are the things I keep in mind when I'm writing documentation. Keeping track of the people. So who do we support? If you come to my talk on Friday, you'll find out about something called the 3 principles of support. And so we have to figure out, who do we support? It might be all the employees that we deal with. It might be the C-level suite. Is it also the spouses of the C-level suite? Do we only support them when they're at work, or do we have to drive out to their house to work with them? Who do we not support? I work in higher ed, and I know a lot of you do as well. If you have a professor who leaves or goes on sabbatical or in some other way, do they still get to call the help desk and ask for things? If they're an emeritus faculty, are you obligated to support them? I'm sure you may or may not have policies about that. Who are the VIPs? Who are the people who get to cut in line? Who are the people who the rules can be slightly bent to support? Figuring those things out. What are the exceptions? What departments do we interact with? And again, I talked about this just a little bit earlier, the HR department for new staff or other workers or faculty. The finance department when it comes time to do budgeting or spending of that allocated money. And other internal departments that you might work with. You might work with facilities or a networking group or someone else. So who gets notified when we've done our job, when things are ready? Who's supposed to be notified? Things are done, they were successful, we feel really proud about it. Who needs to know? Who gets notified when things don't go well? What's the escalation process for when things go a little sideways? How do we deal with that? So when it comes to stuff, you've got similar considerations as well. So these are some of the things we were talking about earlier. When it comes to stuff, you have an inventory, and that hopefully will also tell you where are things located. And not only that, but it's important to know, what does it do? What is its purpose? Why do we have it? What is it designed to do? And when it's time to buy one, where do we get it? What's the process to procure that? How do we handle that? And who do we need to talk to? Once we get it, how do we configure it? What's the process to make it behave the way we want it to behave? Mold it into the vision that we have for the tool. And once we've got it, how do we maintain it? So maintenance is usually a calendar or event-driven process for scheduled maintenance, hopefully not too many unscheduled maintenance events. And once its time is up, how do we get rid of it? How do we dispose of things? When it comes to electronic equipment, e-waste rules, having a procedure and a policy in place for these things becomes very important. And further, again, what do we do when something weird happens, something unexpected, something we didn't plan on? What do we do when bad things happen? When it comes to events, I tend to think of 2 different kinds of events. There's scheduled events, stuff you've planned on, stuff that you know is coming. It's coming up in 2 weeks or 2 months or 2 years. And unscheduled events, like, oops, the RAID just lost a drive. We need to go swap it. Unscheduled events like the HR department calling me on a Friday afternoon and said, oh, by the way, we've got 2 new people starting on Monday. Can you do the needful. Can you have all that stuff ready so that we can just do that? Okay, thanks, bye. Does that happen to anybody else? Am I the only one? Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. I am simultaneously happy and sad to see those hands. Or emergent situations, things that are completely unexpected. Stuff goes sideways. The fiber-seeking backhoe has came and paid you a visit and taken down part of your fiber loop. It happens. So there are lots of events to consider. And they're scheduled, they're unscheduled. There are a lot of events, and I've thought of just a few. Oh, again, the new hire situation that we just talked about. Or somebody who already works for you, but works in a different department, and they're going to come and join someplace new, and you have to figure out what happens then. Or new inventory arrives. You know, you finally got to spend that money, and the big pallet of shrink-wrapped stuff shows up, and it's like Christmas morning. That's fun. Or somebody is moving offices, or it's capital budgeting time. You've got to figure out, for next year, how are we going to allocate these funds? Or what funds do we think we're going to need? What's the planning look like? Or if it's operating budget time, and we have to figure out all of our consumables, how are we going to map those out and budget that and forecast that into the future? Or, what just happened to me recently, this year's budget is now in effect. Quick, time to spend those dollars. And then at the end of the year, it's departmental review time. Let's figure out, what did we do? How did we actually spend this year? It goes quickly. But they want to make sure that they know what's happened. So yeah, one column there. Oh, no, I've got another one. So what happens, not just when somebody gets hired, but what happens if somebody leaves your organization? And that's totally cool. Everybody's happy. They're happy about their new position. You're happy that they're headed there. What happens when, do they need to turn in their equipment? Do you go chase them down for it? Is there a procedure in place for that? What happens if they are leaving, but things didn't go so nicely? Or they're being asked to leave, or the police are there? Something weird is happening. What happens if the people that are leaving not only are in an adversarial position, but those are people from your department? Those are people who had admin passwords. Yikes. How do I make sure that that their ability to cause trouble goes away quickly? When I was a consultant, I worked with a lot of small businesses who were also moving offices, and they didn't always want to pay their phone vendor to come and move lines around. So I said, well, you can either pay them to show up and move the lines around, or you can just order new business cards, and if this person's going to sit at a new desk, just get new business cards, and they can figure out which one is cheaper and which one they want to do. And if you have people that are moving from one desk to another, do they have to call you and schedule a time to get their hardware moved? Do they expect you to do it? Do you expect them to do it? Figuring out what the process and the procedure looks like for that. Getting buy-in from your management about what's appropriate. And I would love to hear your ideas about any of these events. So this is just a starting point for discussion, like I said before. So I've got a third one as well. If you are in charge of managing software subscriptions, when do those expire? For which titles? If you've got leased hardware, you don't own it, but it's going to go away at a certain time. You've got a 3-year lease or a 4-year lease, and that goes away. What do we do then? Or if the warranty on whatever item, a server, a printer, etc., has expired, do you opt for the extended warranty? It's something we've got to figure out. When it's time to impress your boss and say, boss, here are all the things we're in charge of. Here's all the things that happened in this reporting period, whether that's by the month or by the quarter, or by the semester, by the year. How do we build those things? Because the things that you only do every few months, man, those are the easiest things to forget how to do. So having a list to work through is great for that. And then, how do you figure out who's supposed to get new hardware next? And how much is that going to cost? All these events to keep track of. And this is just, I'm sure, the tip of the iceberg. I'm sure you have many, many more that we'll talk about. So when you've got events, you have to have event handlers. I was an AppleScript guy in college, can you tell? So any other AppleScript people? Okay, 3 hands, 4 hands. Thank you. I don't feel alone anymore. That's good. So here's an event handler, a rough idea of things that would happen. So new inventory arrives, and you say, hey, this group of things to do is for the IT staff. Make sure that the vendor actually shipped what you said they said they were going to ship. That would be fantastic. Make sure it's in the right quantity. Check things off. If you've got a barcode scanner and you're scanning barcodes to record things that are on the boxes, make sure you grab that. You might talk about, hey, where do I even find that barcode scanner? And once I have that list of things, does the barcode scanner go directly into inventory? Or do you have to import it? Once you've got new equipment, do you have to move it into secure storage so that nobody just comes by and makes off with a new laptop? You just wonder where it is. Of course, with DEP now, right? They'll take it home, set it up, it'll check in. We'll see. We're not quite there yet at where I work. So then you get to notify your team that, stuff's ready for deployment, and then notify, look, the green thing, the money people, the finance department. Yep, it's all here. It's exactly what we agreed to. Go ahead and pay them. So this is all made up, and the level of detail in here can be whatever you want. But it is very easy to get sucked into being too detailed and to sort of start, again, feeling a bit of anxiety, a little overwhelmed. If I'm spending this much time on this one thing, how am I possibly going to do everything we need to do? But again, you just keep in mind, for every document to write, people, stuff, events. People, stuff, events. People, stuff, events. So let's give it a try. Here is a completely made up thing that I wrote a few weeks ago. So this is a new hire technical checklist that I wrote. It's intended for the ECS team, that's the Eastman Computing Services team. And it talks about what are we going to do when somebody is coming for their first day. So I said, we first have to make sure that we know exactly what it is and specify a nice title, and make sure we get that indexed, and who wrote it and when. We're going to talk about who is it written for, who's the intended audience for this, and what's the goal? What should you be able to do by the time you get done reading this? And if there are specific things that it matters one way or another, you might have some branching built in. But again, the people, stuff, and events kind of work on this framework. The event here is when are you going to begin? And then if you look a little bit closer, you can say the event is whenever academic affairs tells you that a new faculty has been hired, and who to make contact with to get more details, and then what to do, what stuff to interact with in order to keep things moving. So that's an idea there. So there are other considerations to have as well. You have to consider accessibility, which is how are people going to get to the documentation that you've written, and that depends on who the audience is. Think about expiration. The information that we have, the tools we use, the experiences we have aren't that way forever. So putting at the top of the document, hey, I wrote this in July 2018, but let's pretend now it's July 2023. It's been 5 years. Is this still relevant? One of your events may be, hey, we've got documentation that's approaching 5 years old. Let's figure out, is it still relevant? Do we need to update it? Is it good as is? Is it time to just prune it? Or should it be rewritten? Searchability. Even if you've got a big, long collection of documents, how easy is it to find what you need to find? And once you find it, is it readable? Is it legible? Is it structured nicely so that you can kind of follow it and work through? So, yes, please.
Back on that last slide.
Back on the last slide, okay.
The accessibility.
Right. Sure, yes, keeping track of where things are and who has access to that.
That's been our biggest hang-up.
Okay, all right. Again, feel free to interrupt me, throw your hand in the air if you want the catch box. We can do that anytime. Yeah, it's important to make sure that people have the ability to get to the things that you're writing. It doesn't matter how awesome your documentation is if nobody can find it. Oops. All right, we're going to try and get you that catch box. All right, here we go. Hang on to your laptops, hang on to your drinks.
One question I would actually add to this is how secure does the documentation need to be?
Right. What types of sensitive information does your department feel comfortable putting in there? You could put in your documentation usernames and passwords if you want to. If you're confident that that document is going to live in a very secure place, I wouldn't, but people do. You might say in your documentation, to do the following, you will need to have an administrator account. Administrator passwords for this particular process are located in the usual password repository. And then teaching somebody where the usual password repository is when they join the team. That's just part of the onboarding process that you go through. That when they see it, they'll say, oh yeah, we talked about that. I can go find that. So we have lots of time here for discussion. So again, feel free to chime in. Feel free to use that Google Slides link at the top. I'll be taking a look at that very, very soon here to see if we've got people who have chimed in. None yet, but we've got some time. So while you're writing, I've got some ideas for tips. So people, stuff, events. You've heard me talk about that over and over and over. Some tips. When you're writing, and you're writing things, and you don't know where to go next, think about what's the opposite of that, and do a similar one. You might be able to make use of some of the stuff you've already written and just reword certain parts of it. So when you've got new inventory coming in, think about, all right, what happens when old inventory goes out? How is that different? When you've got new people coming in, think about what happens when people go away. Documentation is not just for processes. It's all about putting knowledge in the world. One of the books that I read when I was still a young tadpole of an IT guy was Don Norman's The Design of Everyday Things. And it talked about knowledge in your head versus knowledge in the world. Labeling your environment so that people can find things in a hurry, or when they're stressed, or when weird things are happening, or when they're brand new to your organization, makes everybody happier. Keeping things organized makes everybody happier. And it also helps you figure out, hey, wait a minute, we only have 3 of this cable. We used to have 5. 2 have mysteriously walked away, but we know we're going to need to fill that gap. I work at a music school. Music people are very, very clever and very smart, and they have capabilities for performance that are well beyond anything I could ever hope to do. They are what I call scary smart. And the music theory TA room, luckily I do have a key for that, that room, but if I didn't, they have a secret knock, and as long as you know how to read music and can figure out what that is, they will let you in. But that was something kind of unique to the Eastman environment. So again, it's not just for processes, but it can be for processes too. So what do you do when it's time to shut that server down, when weird stuff is happening and you're not there? You're here at MacAdmins. Something went sideways, and you're the lone IT person. Yikes. Can the departmental administrator jump in with the right keys and handle that with you, maybe over the phone? If it's time to start them back up, can they do that too? If you have new hires, not only in your department, but just in general, how do you let them know, hey, our server is over here. We generally recommend that you save this type of work here and not on your local machine. Or if you have temporary staff that comes in periodically, maybe they're there for 30 days or 60 days or 90 days, what are the things they need to know how to do? Or if you've got a place where the equipment is bolted to the floor, like we do, it can be helpful to put the documentation out in the world. Helps make everybody more comfortable. So, now that you've gotten started, you've figured out your people and your stuff and your events and your writing. One of the most important things I can think of is to only write documentation that people are actually going to read. People want to read what is useful to them. They want to see the result of the intelligence you're putting down that they can make use of, even when you're not there. So you have to kind of define the audience. If your audience is 4-year-olds, can they read? If you are working overseas, can you write the language that they speak? You have to kind of define the parameters of where to start and end. We have a person with a catch box in the back. Go ahead.
You said that, was it on the previous slide? Only write down, yeah. Do you ever write documentation that's the only intended audience is yourself?
Oh, all the time.
Okay. I mean, in those, I mean, you're the only person that's going to be likely to read it then, so how does that documentation look different than it might look for anyone or everyone else?
Sure. So the things that I write for myself, I write in shorthand, not literal shorthand, but I write with a limited vocabulary. I say, hey, don't forget to go pick up the flob grabber, whatever it is, and don't forget to clean. I use phrases like nuke and pave the following 5 machines, and nuke and pave is kind of a jargon term that means something to me, but while I'm here at the conference, if somebody else grabbed that documentation, yikes, Lord only knows what they would do with that. So, but the things I write for myself are usually written in a condensed way. They're usually written based on the knowledge that I already have in my head. But when it comes to writing things for other people, we only have a rough idea of what's in their head or what they're trained to know or what they know based on their own experience. So writing more generally, more carefully, more thoughtfully is usually required. A little bit more formally. So you have to figure out where are these directions going to start and end. If you were going to write a recipe is a classic example of a procedure, right? You have to start with these ingredients. They have to be measured to these amounts. You combine them in the following way. You produce a result that should look like this picture. Mine never look like the picture. But if you're figuring out what the parameters are, do the parameters also include drive to the store and get the following 3 things? They're in aisle 18, aisle 6, and aisle 2. Most recipes would not have that as an example. So you have to kind of define where the start and the end are. And if there are prerequisites, again, like a recipe, if it says you need chicken for this recipe, and if you don't have chicken, then you're not going to make roasted chicken with potatoes. So noting in your documentation what are the prerequisites. Very, very important. And it also helps people if you can put those in at the top, at the beginning, so that they know to go fetch those before they read further. Sometimes documentation can be pages and pages long. I had a piece of documentation from the finance department lately about how to perform a certain kind of report. The procedure was 43 steps, and it was on 18 pages. Had very nice screenshots with it, but it was remarkably drawn out. And I need to know before I get to step 27 if I still have the login that I need to get to the place that they're talking about. It would help to know that in advance. Otherwise, I'm halfway through, and I won't be successful. Using adjectives. Adjectives are fantastic. They tell you they help you be more specific and describe what you're talking about. Adjectives describe what kind, how many, and which one. So like the blue button in the following dialogue, click it. The 2 cables that you see at the back of the machine that are green, unplug both of them. The largest icon that you see in managed software is not the one to use. If you're writing, be consistent with your item names. If you're going to describe something with a particular name, make sure you use that throughout the rest of your steps. If you're going to use, and I think this is later on, if you're going to use jargon like nuke and pave, the first time you use it, just define what that means so that people are clear about it. You have to figure out where are people going to be when they read this. I'm assuming we're talking about written documentation. So are they going to be in a server room that has lots of air conditioning blowing on them, that's very noisy? Are they going to be in a place that has a ridiculous smell for some reason, where they're otherwise going to be distracted by things? And if things are going to take a long time to complete, or a very short time to complete. Let people know what to expect. So if you tell people, hold down the Option key at startup, you should see the following within 15 seconds. So when it takes 45 seconds or 2 minutes or 5 minutes and they're still sitting there holding down the Option key and they say, I can't tell if this is broken or if it's working or if it's slow. Well, if you put it in the documentation, hey, it should probably take about this long and it should look like this when it's working right. If it doesn't look like this, repeat the step. That helps people out. Verify that you have the prerequisites done. So you can say, all right, if you've done the following 3 things, then you're ready to move on to this. And for sequential things, this is something that they taught my son and daughter in English class several years ago. If you're describing a process, use first, then, next, 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 and finally. If you have photos or screenshots, if they're clear, if they have a background that isn't very busy, if you can include those in your documentation, all the better. I love screenshots. I loved it when clients sent screenshots to me. When I get emails, it would just say, help. I'd say, I'd love to. What do I need to do? What do I need to know? I think that was one of the first things I taught every client I ever had was how to email me a screenshot. I don't want to have to rely upon them to describe what they're seeing using concepts they understand and words that they know about. I want them to just be able to give me the facts, and I can kind of deduce what's going on from there. And again, jargon, try not to use it unless you know that your intended audience is going to get it. Try not to have a lot of parenthetical statements. Keep things as focused as you can. And when you're using those photos, this is built into Preview now. You can add little arrows that will point to things, which are really nice. Some user interfaces are very, very busy these days. It's tricky to figure out precisely what you mean. Putting a big red circle around it with an arrow pointing to it helps you figure that out. Again, especially if it's 2:30 in the morning, you've been working on a down server all night, you want to bring it back up, but you're not quite sure what to go on. It's nice to have the documentation that you can pull in, look at it, and figure out what to do next, and to follow that along, even when you might not be at 100%. So there are lots of other resources in the MacAdmin community. All these slides will be presented to you later, so you don't have to break your wrist trying to write all these things down. You'll see at the bottom here, let's see if I can make this work, this guy. derflounder.wordpress.com. Who's heard of this guy? Rich Troughton? Yes, he is the king of documentation. In fact, I think I was in this very room a couple of years ago attending his documentation presentation. It's on YouTube. You can check it out. They were making peanut butter and jelly sandwiches that year and how to describe how to do that. And then they were having a member of the audience who was playing dumb and would come up and follow the directions as they were written, and with hilarious results. So be sure to check that out too. There is a documentation channel on MacAdmin Slack. It's something I started several months ago. Feel free to join me there. We can talk about all kinds of things. If you want to bounce ideas off of me, we can do that. We can talk about, again, Don Norman's Design of Everyday Things, fantastic book. Puts you in kind of a different frame of mind about why things are the way they are. And Limoncelli's PSNA, Practice of System and Network Administration. Great book. Have your boss buy it for you. Lots of great stuff in there. And a book that I read probably 15 years ago called Don't Make Me Think, about interface design, specifically for the web, but it applies to any time you're describing how to use something, or you are producing something that somebody else is going to use away from you later without talking to you. It's great to think about. There are also some other URLs that I found about simple documentation that I think are really worth checking out. Again, you'll have all of these in the slides. So these are the ideas that I wanted to present regarding documentation. And so we're now to the question and discussion part. We have plenty of time to talk about that. The man with the Kangol and the And the and the catch box is ready to hurl things or pass things gently to you if you have things that you want to talk about. Okay, yep, please. Oh, great. Okay. Yes, I have 2 different questions on Google. Let's hit those first. And if you want to throw your hand in the air if you didn't get these in. All right, so Joe asks, how do you make time for documentation? I've heard of organizations that have a read-only Friday. We have that where I work. You know how we got it? I said, this is what we're doing. For example, where time is explicitly set aside for people to document the work they've done up until that point in the week. Read-only Friday, the concept is you don't make fundamental changes to configurations of equipment on a Friday. Why? Because that endangers your weekend. And nobody should care more about your weekend than you. And nobody has the ability to do more to damage your own weekend than you. So, Read-only Friday is a great day for filling out paperwork that you've been putting off. It's a great day for, again, getting your documentation figured out. When we started doing this, we had this, but we also factor it into any time we're making a change or anytime we notice, oops, hang on, that didn't work quite right. And whether that's imaging equipment or deploying equipment to a new hire, we say, we need to make a note of that. We quickly flag that and put even a placeholder in our documentation with a date and the time. And Dennis said we need to add the following. And then they'll come back and handle that. And we'll make that a ticket in our ticketing system to keep that up to date. Putting tickets in your ticketing system helps people understand that this is important. And you might set a certain priority to it, but I think it's really important to make time to do it. It only helps you in the future and helps you be calm and confident in your position. Shauna asks, how do you get a team to understand that the reason for an easy procedure, but they still forget it missing several steps? Okay, understand the reason for an easy procedure. In my case, the onboarding and offboarding process approved by management. Yes. So the purpose of your documentation is to help everyone or to communicate something in a very clear and very standardized way to your audience. And your audience may be that new hire themselves. It may be the hiring manager saying, hey, we understand you've got a new hire coming. Please tell us the following. Please tell us what their phone number is going to be, what office are they going to sit in, which departmental shares do they need access to, do they need access to certain kinds of equipment or a different kind of desk for accessibility reasons, or do they need access to a personal laser printer rather than the departmental printer for certain reasons? There are all sorts of different things that we go through with new hires. But in terms of understanding the reason for that procedure, the reason is, without those procedures, your department is going to fall into a trap. And the trap is you are going to be working to someone else's expectations of you rather than the expectations that you define that you will provide. I think that's the easiest way I can put that. I hope that answers the question for Shauna. So those are the questions I have so far in Google. Are there any others in the room? We have lots and lots of time.
How do you, one of the problems I have is I can target the documentation, whether it's end user or somebody else within a department. The problem is you need to document how they get to the documentation.
Sure.
And getting that out to them is documentation.
It's true. Here's an example from where I work. When I started, users didn't always know how to find my team when they had a question. So they might have a problem at their desk, and they might talk to their departmental administrator. Hey, isn't there a group that handles computer questions on our campus? Yes, there is. We're here. So what we did is we, again, documented this and, again, put the knowledge out in the world. We made a tiny little sticker that goes nicely on monitor bezels that says, "Need help?" ? Call Eastman Computing. Has our phone number right there. So I don't know if that exactly answers it, but figuring out kind of the simple way to keep things going is probably a great place to start. I'm all about simple, small, achievable results, and then we can kind of build on that. And the sticker approach worked for us. We got 200 of them for ridiculously cheap prices. Stickermule.com is your friend on that one.
As far as the getting where to find the documentation out, we've, for default desktop backgrounds, it has that information, like the number of the tech desk, and that's especially true in classrooms.
Sure.
So in
Any
like
public
classrooms
space.
and presenting areas, we just have, call this number if you have a problem,
Right.
or here's the email address and
Right.
stuff like that.
Yes. So yeah.
But I was going to
Please
follow
continue.
up on Shauna's question, which is kind of, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. But also if you are doing something like onboarding, which involves a lot of different departments, how do you get the upper level buy-in to tell people, no, you do have to read this, you do have to follow this procedure, because if you don't, you're going to have things like new employees who show up who don't have accounts, or people who show up and think that they should have an account and say, where's my computer? And we're like, we didn't even know you were here.
Do you work where I work?
I work in higher ed.
I literally have people that started Monday that we found out about last week, and we have 2 more that I just found out about yesterday that are going to start this coming Monday. But yes, so the question is, how do you let people know, hey, this is important? We're going through that exact same situation at Eastman right now, quite literally. I am in the process. I have gotten buy-in by explaining. It's all about perception. Eastman wants to have, and does have for the most part, wants to have the perception that they really have stuff all under control. They've really got it all figured out. This is a smooth process. It's like the swan gliding across the water, moving very smoothly, and underneath it's paddling like crazy to deliver all the things that they need to do. And I'm trying to let them know, if your goal is to be perceived in a way where everybody is super competent, hyper competent, and that things are ready for you, and that we treat it, yeah, it's no big deal. Go ahead, get started. This is what it takes to do that. And the vision that your upper management has for how your organization wants to be perceived, talking about the organization as a whole, and the vision they have for that culture, this is one of the boots on the ground ways that you achieve that, is by making sure that the right people have the things communicated to them. Letting them know, hey, this is a prerequisite. This has to be done. If it's not done, you're going to end up with results you don't like. And it's going to make you look silly. People don't like to look silly. It's embarrassing. Especially if you're the boss. So working with them and letting them know, if you want to achieve your vision for your organization, doing things in this procedure will get you there. We have a question from Alexander. He wants to ask the whole group, what are people's thoughts on templated documentation? Sure, a lot of the battle is getting team members to document any processes to begin with, but when everyone is documenting differently, it's hard to follow quickly and efficiently. But we do need flexibility for some write-ups as well. So templated documentation is great because it gives you kind of a format to follow. And as long as it's a format that has buy-in from whoever's in charge of the people writing all the documentation, then it can be very helpful. I tend to think that templates are great because they help structure things. They get a lot of the boilerplate out of the way. So for instance, that slide where I wrote the title and then my name and the date, those kinds of things are all sort of templated. You could easily imagine the mail merge fields that would have gone into making that. Then you can just sort of fill it in like it's a form. That takes a lot of the hassle out of it. You still need some flexibility, sort of not in the header part of it, but in the body section. But that can be a great place to start. Does anybody have any other thoughts about that? Templated documentation, where to start? Or even just borrowing existing documentation, ripping out all the details, and then just keeping the same structure? Okay. I hope that answers the question, Alexander.
So one of the things that, going back to the onboarding discussion, is Well, it seems to be a huge issue. I was just at another conference for independent schools with tech directors there, and the onboarding, offboarding issue was a really big problem, particularly for us, in that we come at the different departments asking the questions, like where is this, because I don't think anyone completely sees the whole.
Right. They only see what's in front of them.
That's one of the things that we've actually taken to doing is rather than having the conversations, expanding on what you said, is basically putting together almost like an infographic.
Sure.
That shows where all, because you could talk to people about it, but they don't, we found that them seeing it, diagramming it, at least giving them something to look at, the big picture, literally,
Sure.
has helped. But I mentioned one of the things, and I knew you mentioned earlier we weren't necessarily talking about tools, but one of the things is we've tried to like put this together and manage this in a Google Sheet, and it really doesn't work because no one knows when anything happens. You have to always go back in and check it. And the one thing that was recommended to us for both onboarding and offboarding was a tool called Smart Sheets. If you go to smartsheets.com,
Okay.
you can set all of these things up, put dependencies and notifications on them.
Right.
So it's a pared down version of like a project management tool, or it is. I mean, it is a project management tool, but
Right.
it's one where you can set it up. And I've seen it done at another school with particularly good success using
Okay.
it. We have yet to implement it, and I actually have a call with the guy who's doing it next Monday to talk through it a little bit more, because as much as we at our school talked about this problem and this issue coming into this summer, we're still dealing with the same problems. It's better documented in some way, but the problems still are there.
Right. It's tricky, and again, for the onboarding, offboarding situation, there are lots of people that are in play, lots of departments in play, whether that's HR, whether that's facilities, hauling desks or equipment or filing cabinets and getting an office quote unquote ready for a new hire, and when they're going to have that done, and are they going to put the filing cabinet in front of the network jack again and right up against it and crush the network cable, all of these things. Trying to get all of those departments on the same page about things, that's another challenge that I'm actively dealing with. When we just had somebody who just retired after 35 years of service to Eastman, their office had not been painted in 35 years, so facility said, well, as soon as we get so-and-so out of there, we've got to make sure we take a look at the carpet and see if that needs to be replaced, make sure we paint. And I said, okay, how soon do you think you're going to have this done? Let me get back to you on that. And I said, well, the new person has to be in there before the fall. Let me get back to you on that. I can't find that on my calendar. So let's try and at least put a target date in. But managing all the different people and departments that have to come together to make something like that happen it's a lot of communication more than anything else. And that's really what documentation is. It's formalized communication. So we have another question here from John. Let me see if I can scroll to this and click present. Here it comes. John asks, do you have a peer review process for documentation? A particular challenged maybe user that you go to test user documentation? At Eastman, yes, we do. We have an engineer that is new to our group. He's only been here not quite a year. And I wanted him to document this new thing that he had designed and set up. And I said, I want you to write the documentation, and I want you to hand the documentation to our student worker. The student worker is going to follow your documentation. They've never done this before. And your job is to go and see what the result was after they followed it. So it's sort of like the build and analyze equivalent of real world analog stuff. You write the documentation, hand it off to somebody. They build it based on what they saw, and then you take a look at their result. Did they build what you intended to? If not, where does your documentation fall down? Maybe you assumed that they had knowledge that they didn't have. Maybe they weren't able to understand particular steps or the sequence. Maybe there's a step missing that you're like, oh my goodness, I can't believe I forgot that. So we at Eastman do have a peer review for at least internal technical things. Things like spinning up a new VM. Things like building a new mailing list for someone. Things that need to get done like that. Other questions or comments or topics for discussion? All right. I see some hands in the air. We're going to get that catch box to you.
You ready?
Okay, here we go.
I have sort of a follow-up from what I asked earlier about making time for documentation.
Yes.
Do you ever document as you go? Do you prefer to document as you go? Do you wait until you're done and then go back and write it all down? And also, how much of a perfectionist are you with your documentation? And when do you kind of draw that line and say it's good enough, it doesn't need to look any better? Or I could probably spend way more time than is appropriate making my documentation look nice and formatted the way I want to and consistent across our library of documentation than is maybe necessary, and end up not being productive in other ways.
Right. Can you see anybody else here who has a green lanyard? Green lanyards at MacAdmins mean you're a speaker, and I bet that means if you're like me, that you've been revising and updating these slides a little bit at a time for weeks. And at a certain point, for me that was about 45 minutes before I came down here, you said, okay, that's it. We're just going to go with this and it'll be fine. And at a certain point you have to ship. You can't just tweak and tweak and tweak. For me personally, for projects where I know I'm doing it, there's like these 6 things where I work that are done like every 8 months. And as I mentioned earlier, 8 months is just long enough for me to forget the details or the sequence or the prerequisites to do something. So I will go through and I will document a couple of steps. I will write them down. I'll say, hey, if you're going to do this, remember the following, future Dennis. I'm writing this to help you. Figure these things out. Don't forget about number 7, because without that, it all falls apart. And I will document that as I go, especially if I know it's something I'm going to have to do again in the future and that nobody else has written. I will do that. I also, when it comes to editing, personally, I find that it's always easier to edit something that's already on the page than it is to try and edit it in my head and then put it out. I will put down, how many of you were internet users in the 90s? Used Netscape, and you'd go to load a GIF, not animated, just a regular GIF over dial-up, and it would come in and be super fuzzy. And then it would revise and get a little bit better, and a little bit better, and then the last pass would be perfect. That's kind of how I go with my writing. I'm like, let's just kind of get the rough idea, the rough shape of this, and then let's factor it in and factor it in. I guess that's probably a top-down approach. That's how I tend to do it, but your mileage may vary. If anybody have any other thoughts about that or how they choose to do it?
Using Git to maintain documentation helps you update in small chunks.
I thoroughly agree. I aspire to be far smarter about Git than I currently am. And Git is one of those things that I recognize would be tremendously useful, but I've never quite gotten my head around it. And documentation is probably a good place to start with that. Where I work, I know we said I wouldn't really talk about tools. We've started using a tool called Confluence. Confluence is a product by Jira. I see a lot of heads nodding. Previous to that, we were using MediaWiki, and we were not using a recent version of MediaWiki. This was a very old version of MediaWiki that made it really hard to do things like put screenshots in it, and it drove me crazy. So moving to Confluence has made life a lot easier for us. Confluence is not free, but it does have a lot of features like notification. So if you intend to update something somebody else wrote, or you have a question that went at the bottom of it, you can say, not only update this, but notify the people who have elected to be notified about this particular document. And then they get an email that says, hey, this has been dealt with. Anyone else? Question, comment, idea for discussion? That's why we're here. Sure, please.
So with the advent of screen capture software, do you still find it really advantageous to keep your documentation in written form? I know lately I've been recording a lot of my documentation. It's just easier to say, hey, here you go, watch me do this.
Right.
And that's it. And I can record and then narrate after or narrate as I go, but it's just kind of sometimes easier to even describe things just by showing somebody than having to take, 5 screenshots to get through every single tab that you have
Right.
to go through. And, make sure you get all these boxes. So I'm trying to kind of figure out if there's really still kind of a place where, things just really need to be written, or if, that's kind of the way that documentation's heading towards.
I'm from Rochester, New York. Rochester, New York is home to many wonderful things, including a company named Ambrosia Software.
I'm a RIT.
Yeah, I'm an alumni myself. So, Ambrosia Software is a longtime Mac developer, and one of their most famous products is a product called Snaps Pro. And Snaps Pro is a screen recording tool. 2 lifetimes ago, I wrote for Ziff Davis, and one of the things I wrote about was how to make training materials where you record your screen and send things out. So this is something I'm very, very familiar with. With the advent of things like YouTube, with the advent of other video sharing services, I would say the challenge with video is that it's all about discovery. So even if you've got a URL to a video, you've got to figure out how are people going to get drawn to that. So you have to have a description that is really well written, that describes the process you're going to go through. Or how do people know that this video is right for them? If it's a 20-minute video, are you covering all the important things, or does it need to be edited down? I think that video will always be great for some certain learning styles. I think that step-by-step directions that people can mentally check off as they go will be valuable for other types of learning styles and other age groups and other people who are comfortable with technology in certain ways. I don't think there's a definite answer here, like so many technical things and the tools that we have available, but I think that it's more about figuring out what matches your brain best so that you can communicate with others. And if you can do that in a very accessible way, I think that's about as valuable as you can hope to be.
Sure, yeah, and we've been kind of using a combination of Confluence and we use Panopto for screen capture for our course recording for classrooms anyways, so we kind of just have that at our disposal.
Right.
So a lot of my documentation now is, hey, here's where it is in Confluence, and then all it is there is just a link to the video.
Right.
And I think the big advantage I'm seeing there is we can create easy, quick documentation for our users too, where it's like, hey, you need to learn how to do this thing quick in Office, let me record it and send it to you, so.
Yes. Yeah, one of the things that I recorded for a client back in that part of my lifetime was they've been using Excel for years but didn't understand what a formula was. So I said, well, I can describe to you this over the phone, I can write it out for you, or I can record a 2-minute video where I say, we're going to take these 2 cells, we're going to multiply them together and put the result over here. And I took the 2 minutes, I made the recording. I had to do it 3 times because I kept misspeaking and whatnot. So there was a little bit of overhead there in terms of time. But when I sent the link off to the client and they watched it, they said, I had to watch it a couple of times, but I think I got it. And I'm so thankful that you were able to describe this to me. I knew that that particular person reading a set of steps with screenshots wasn't how they like to learn. But if I were there next to them, I would describe it in the following way, and they would be watching the screen, and they would ask questions. So a video was a good fit for that.
Sure. So yeah, it kind of goes back to your whole point on knowing your audience then.
Yes, knowing your audience it's the key to everything.
Just to piggyback like on that same thing, that's almost like a merging of documentation and training. And it's almost like you're coming up with like an on-demand training, which I've been doing a little bit, at our school too, where it's like people, I'll just like, things that are kind of relevant, I'll make a quick 1 or 2 minute video clip and put it in a folder of training videos. But
okay.
I've also had people email me like, oh, I'm having trouble with this, and I'll just do a quick screen,
right.
Capture and show them that and send it to them. But it's almost like it's documentation, but yet it's also training at the same time, but do you handle them differently, or do you, to the point of the video files, you can still link to them from the same exact documentation sources where you have a simple document. Here's the documentation on how to do this, and there's the link, and you play the video.
Right.
And on top of that, if you wanted to just put in some paragraphs and a couple of screenshots as well, you could do it as well. Have the video and that stuff. But there's no reason why you can't, other than time limitations, kind of do both.
True. A couple of Christmases ago, I was still brand new to Eastman. Eastman is a school of music. I don't play music. I play the radio. So my wife said, this won't do. And she bought me a ukulele. And she said, there are 4 strings, you have 4 fingers, it can't be that hard. And I said, okay, cool, I'll give it a shot. And what I found was there's a number of people online on YouTube that will happily teach you how to play the ukulele. And they do it not only by playing it so you can hear what it's supposed to sound like, but they also show you where you're supposed to put your fingers at certain points. So they are describing it as also playing it for you. And that's kind of where we're at. So you're describing how to do something, but also showing you what the results look like as you move along. So I think that there's a place for both of those things. And again, knowing your audience really helps with that. All right. Any other thoughts? Yep, if you could talk right into the correct box, we'll keep things moving. It does say I have 5 minutes left, so we'll
So as
keep
far
things
as
rolling.
getting your content out to people too, that's kind of broken down some barriers with the videos we can share with people outside of our organization too.
Okay.
So that way, I don't know, if somebody's corresponding with somebody and collaborating using, I don't know, like Box or
Sure.
some other Google Docs, they can, share that out to their collaborators as well. So kind of that point of, we don't know where to put the documentation so it'll reach everyone. And if you're using something like Confluence, it has to be somebody within your organization.
That's true. Yeah, we use that for internal stuff.
So, that has kind of broken down that wall as well of just being able to share that out with the world if you desire.
Right, yeah, and as long as it's branded properly and vetted by all the appropriate legal teams to make sure you're not showing something that's security
Right.
sensitive, then
Yeah.
you're probably all right.
Absolutely.
One thing I was going to mention is that instead of going full video, one thing that I've done is it's a kind of a hybrid with the screenshots
Okay,
of making animated GIFs.
okay,
So I still have that breakdown because one thing that has always frustrated me, my background is in film production, is seeing 20-minute video, and I know about 50% of where I want to be, but trying to find in the video where they start talking about things I don't know. That's where I like the breakdown of the step-by-step with screenshots, but the screenshots sometimes don't get the point across, so that's why I like doing the animated GIFs.
right. If you ever get a chance, and your university may or may not have a subscription to lynda.com, check out, I see, all right, lots of heads nodding. Check out lynda.com because they also have a transcript of what the person is saying, and you can scrub through that, click the word, and it will jump the video to that specific spot. That can really help.
To your point of video, though, the one thing we've done in a lot of stuff, more so for user, like end user, not like back-end documentation though, but it's something we try to adhere to, is if you have print documentation, try to keep it to like what we call the one-pager.
Okay,
And if you do video, no more than 2 minutes. So the 20-minute one that you're talking about where you're trying to find what it is, and Linda and some of the other ones do this, is they really break them into these much smaller chunks.
yeah, very digestible.
So it's really a matter of looking at what you're doing and segmenting what you're doing down to the discrete parts.
All right, we got 2 minutes on the timer. We can make it.
I would totally agree with that, and I would also encourage transcripts on videos because for me, I hate watching videos because I usually get interrupted every 4.5 seconds.
I hear
So
Again,
pausing
do
a
you work where I
video
work?
and then starting it again, and then
Yeah,
it's incredibly frustrating, and it means that I can't do anything else while that's happening. But if I'm reading documentation and someone says, "Hey, what do I do with this?" I can look up from what I'm reading
right, put your finger there.
and and then go back to it. And so for me, if I have to if the only instructions I can find are a video, I will probably just figure it out by myself.
Right, cool. All right, anybody else? All right, we have just a couple minutes. We'll make it happen. Everybody gets a chance.
So what do you do if you have users that no matter how good your documentation is, no matter how perfectly written, they just refuse to even look at it and try to understand it, and they just want you to do whatever it is for them? What's the best way to combat that culture that some people seem to adopt?
That is not a technical problem, that is a management problem. I'm sorry to be glib about that, but I think that's the best answer I could possibly give. Talk to their manager, say, your report is eating more resources than typical. Here are things that they've asked us recently, show them the tickets. Here is how much time we've spent on that. let them know this isn't normal, let them know what training opportunities exist, and make that part of something that that manager can talk about with the person on their one-on-ones that they have. That's the best I can do. Again, it's not a technical problem. All right, that is the end. Thank you so much for coming. I appreciate it very much.